Hey guys, tonight we're going back to a warm September morning in 1988, to a quiet stretch of two-lane highway in central New Mexico, and to a 19-year-old girl named Tara Calico, who climbed onto a borrowed pink bicycle, told her mother she would be home by noon, and then simply vanished from a road she had ridden almost every day of her life. She was 2 miles from her own front door. It was the middle of the morning, in plain daylight, on a road where people were hunting and ranching and even playing a round of golf nearby. And in the space of about 15 minutes, somewhere along that open, sunlit road, Tara Calico disappeared so completely that 37 years later, investigators are still searching the bottom of an abandoned mine shaft, hoping to finally bring her home. Before we settle in for this one, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find value in the kind of stories we tell here. No pressure and no guilt. And thank you, truly, for all the case suggestions you continue to send us. We're also now on Spotify, so if you would rather listen there while you drift off, the link is in the description. Now, dim the lights. Get comfortable. This is a long one, and Tara's story deserves to be heard slowly and carefully, because behind the famous photograph and the decades of headlines was a real young woman with a real life. She was the kind of person who planned her days down to the hour, who rode the same long desert road for the simple love of moving fast under an open sky, who had a tennis date that afternoon and every intention of keeping it. To understand what happened, we need to go back to before any of it. Have you ever wondered how a person can disappear in broad daylight on a familiar road, only minutes from home, and leave almost nothing behind? How a single photograph found in a parking lot 2,000 miles away could reopen a wound and never quite let it close? And how a case can stay unsolved for nearly 4 decades, even when the people investigating it will tell you, quietly, that they believe they know what happened. Let's start at the beginning. Let's go back to a small town in the high desert, and to a girl on a bicycle, on a road that ran straight toward the morning sun. If you have never been to Belen, New Mexico, picture a small railroad town strung along the Rio Grande, about 35 miles south of Albuquerque, where the land flattens out into pale scrub and the sky goes on forever. It is the kind of place where the mountains sit blue and distant on the horizon, where freight trains move through at all hours, and where the high desert light has a clean, white quality in the morning that photographers spend their whole lives chasing. In the late 1980s, it was a community of a few thousand people, the sort of town where families had known one another for generations, and where a girl on a bicycle was a familiar sight on the long roads that ran out toward the open country. Tara Lee Calico was born here on the last day of February in 1969. By the autumn of 1988, she was 19 years old, living just outside Belen in a community called Rio Communities, with her mother, Patty, and her stepfather, John Dole. Her parents had divorced when she was young, and her mother had remarried. She had a brother, Chris, and a stepsister, Michelle. She was, by every account from the people who knew her, an ordinary, bright, deeply likable young woman, the kind whose absence would leave a particular shape in a room. She was a sophomore at the University of New Mexico's Valencia County campus, a careful student who took her work seriously. She had a part-time job at a bank in town, and on the morning she disappeared, she was wearing a white t-shirt with the words, First National Bank of Belen, printed across the front. That detail has always struck me as quietly heartbreaking because it is so completely the detail of a normal life. She was a college kid with a part-time job and a bank logo on her shirt, the kind of thing thousands of 19-year-olds wear without a second thought. Now picture the rhythm of her days. Friends and family described Tara as a meticulous planner, someone who slotted her hours into a tidy schedule and kept to it. There were her classes and the studying that went with them, and her part-time work and time carved out for the people she loved. And then, almost every morning, the ride. The ride was the thing. Tara was an athlete, fit and fast and disciplined, and she had a route she knew by heart. A long out and back stretch of New Mexico State Road 47 that ran south and then looped her home, somewhere between 36 and 38 miles, depending on how far she pushed. She rode it most mornings, often alone, sometimes with her mother riding alongside her. It was exercise and it was discipline. But if you have ever loved the feeling of a long ride on an empty road, you understand that it was probably something more than that too. It was the part of the day that belonged only to her. The pedals turning, the desert sliding past, the music in her headphones, the whole open morning stretched out ahead. She listened to a Sony Walkman while she rode, a cassette tape spinning in that small plastic case clipped near her, the way half of her generation moved through the world in those years before phones, before earbuds, before any of it. You can almost see her. A young woman in white shorts with green stripes, turquoise and white sneakers, a couple of gold rings and small gold hoop earrings catching the light, brown hair with a stubborn cowlick at the right temple, freckles, green eyes, riding fast and easy down a road she had ridden 100 times before. Let's talk about the kind of person she was beyond the schedule and the bike, because this is where she becomes real. Tara loved to read, and her favorite author was V.C. Andrews, the writer behind a whole shelf of dark, gothic family dramas that were enormously popular with teenagers in the 1980s. Her favorite of those books was a novel called My Sweet Audrina. I want you to hold on to that small, ordinary fact, the favorite book of a 19-year-old girl, because in about a year it is going to surface again in a way that no one could have predicted, and it is going to break a mother's heart. To understand the morning she disappeared, you also have to understand something her mother had already noticed, something that had quietly worried her for a while. Patty Dole used to ride alongside Tara on that long desert route. But at some point before that September, Patty stopped. She had begun to feel that they were being watched on those rides, that a motorist had been following them, lingering, paying the kind of attention that makes the back of your neck prickle. She felt stalked, and so she stopped riding, and she worried. And like any mother, she tried to put a small piece of armor in her daughter's hands. She suggested that Tara carry mace on her rides, something, anything, just in case. Tara said no. And here, I want to be careful, because it would be the easiest thing in the world to turn that into a lesson, into the kind of thing a narrator points to and says, if only. But that is not fair to Tara. And it is not fair to the truth. She was a 19-year-old who had ridden that road safely countless times. She was confident and strong, and she felt, as 19-year-olds feel, more or less invincible on her own familiar ground. Declining to carry mace on a morning bike ride in your own hometown is not a mistake. It is just being young. The mistake, whatever it was, belonged entirely to whoever was waiting on that road. Let's stay with her for a moment longer, because it matters that you see her clearly before the rest of this story takes her away from us. The people who knew Tara did not describe a girl who lived in the margins. They described someone fully in the middle of her own life, someone with plans that reached out past that autumn and into a future she had every reason to expect she would get to live. She was close with her mother in a way that was unusual for a young woman her age, the kind of closeness where a parent is also, quietly, a friend. The two of them rode together, talked together, moved through the small rhythms of that household together. When you hear that Patty would later spend the rest of her life searching, it is worth understanding that she was not only searching for a missing person in the abstract. She was searching for someone she had shared a road with, morning after morning, the wheels turning side by side in the desert quiet. Tara had a boyfriend and a tennis date on the calendar, and the ordinary social geography of a 19-year-old in a small town, the friends and the part-time co-workers and the familiar faces at the campus and the bank. She had a body she trusted, an athlete's confidence in her own legs and lungs. She had a favorite book and a Walkman full of music and a route she could have ridden with her eyes closed. None of that is remarkable, and that is exactly the point. There was nothing about Tara Calico that marked her out for what happened to her. She was not reckless. She was not lost. She was not living some hidden double life that investigators would later have to untangle. To be fair to everyone who has ever looked at this case, that very ordinariness is part of what makes it so hard to sit with. If she had been careless, you could tell yourself a story about cause and effect. But she was careful. She told her mother when to come looking. She knew her road. She did everything more or less right, and it did not save her. There is a particular kind of grief that attaches to a person who vanishes in the middle of an ordinary day, doing an ordinary thing, and I think it is worth naming here at the start. It is the grief of interruption. Tara was not at the end of something. She was in the middle of a Tuesday, in the middle of a semester, in the middle of a young life that had momentum and direction and 100 small loose ends she fully intended to come back and tie up. When she rode out that morning, she left a room that expected her to return to it. She left plans on a calendar. She left a tennis date she meant to keep. Everything about the way she left the house that day was provisional, temporary, the leaving of someone who is coming right back. And that, more than any single eerie detail, is the thing that has kept people circling this case for almost 4 decades. Somewhere on a familiar road, an ordinary morning simply stopped, and a girl who was supposed to come home did not. There is one more detail from the weeks before that has come up in the investigation over the years, and it is worth mentioning here while remembering that it has never been firmly tied to what happened. According to some accounts, threatening notes had been left on Tara's car in the months before she vanished. In the very early going, investigators reportedly considered whether those might have been the work of local high school kids, the sort of cruel, stupid pranking that teenagers sometimes do. Whether those notes were connected to her disappearance or were just noise or were something more sinister that got dismissed too quickly has never been established. But it sits there in the timeline, a small dark thread, a hint that someone may have had Tara on their mind before that September morning ever arrived. Now picture the night before, an ordinary Monday evening in a small New Mexico town. Tara at home with her mother and her stepfather, plans for the next day already laid out in that careful way of hers. She had a tennis date scheduled with her boyfriend for 12:30 the following afternoon. She would do her morning ride first, the way she almost always did, and be back in plenty of time to clean up and go. And here is the detail that tells you everything about who Tara was, and that would, within hours, become the most important sentence anyone said that whole week. Before she left the next morning, Tara told her mother that if she was not home by noon, Patty should come looking for her. Some accounts say she framed it around the possibility of a flat tire, a practical worry, because she would be on her mother's bike rather than her own. It was a small, sensible, almost throwaway instruction. The kind of thing you say on your way out the door. Come find me if I'm not back. She had no way of knowing how those words would land, that a casual aside about a flat tire would become the thread her mother clung to. That come find me would echo through the next 37 years, through search parties and television studios and sealed court files, through a mother's entire remaining life. On that Monday night, it was nothing. It was just Tara being Tara, organized and considerate, telling her mum the plan. Tuesday morning came clear and warm. September 20th, 1988. And Tara Calico got ready for a ride she had taken 100 times before. There was a small complication that morning, and like so much in this case, it was the kind of thing that means nothing until suddenly it means everything. Tara's own bicycle had a problem. Most accounts describe a flat tire or a bike that was otherwise out of commission. Whatever the exact issue, her own bike was not ready to ride. So Tara did the obvious thing. She borrowed her mother's. Patty's bike was hard to miss. It was a neon pink Huffy mountain bike, bright as a road flare, with yellow control cables and yellow sidewalls. If you wanted to design a bicycle to be seen from a distance on a pale desert road, you could hardly do better. That detail matters because it means Tara was not a quiet shape slipping along the shoulder that morning. She was vivid, she was visible, the kind of figure the eye catches without trying. People would remember the pink bike, and people did remember the pink bike, and yet, somehow, no one would remember the one thing that mattered. She left the house at around 9:30 in the morning. Take a moment to picture it the way it actually was, because the ordinariness is the whole point. A Tuesday, late September, the air dry and warming as the sun climbed. A young woman in a white bank t-shirt and green striped shorts, gold hoops in her ears, sneakers on the pedals, headphones on, the cassette already playing. She had her route. She had her plan. She had a tennis date at 12:30 and the easy confidence of someone doing the most normal thing in the world. Her route ran along New Mexico State Road 47, a 2-lane highway that threads south out of the Belen area through open country. It is not a hidden road. It is not a wilderness trail. It is a real working highway, hemmed by fence lines and scrub and the occasional house or business, with ranch land spreading out on either side and an old copper mine sitting off to the north. Cars use it. Trucks use it. On any given morning, there are people out along its length, going about their lives. The plan that day, according to the original police report, was to ride 47 down toward Highway 60 and then turn and come back, and out and back, the same loop she always rode. Now I want to walk you through that morning as carefully as the record allows, because the timeline is almost unbearably tight, and it is the heart of why this case has never let go of the people who work it. You're on Highway 47 that morning. The sun is up and climbing. Heat shimmer is starting to rise off the blacktop in the distance. You hear the hum of the occasional vehicle, the wind, the small mechanical ticking of a bicycle being ridden hard. And along that road, that morning, a number of perfectly ordinary people happened to be out. There were motorists driving the highway. There was a group of deer hunters. There were ranch hands working the land. There was at least one neighbor who knew Tara by sight. And in a detail that has always carried a strange, sunlit ordinariness, there were several women out playing a round of golf on the west side of the road. This was not an empty place. This was a road full of witnesses. And that is exactly what makes what happened so hard to understand. Several of those people saw Tara. They saw the pink bike, the young woman riding it, heading north along 47, coming back toward home. The last confirmed sighting that investigators have settled on puts her on that road at around 11:45 in the morning. She was close. By the geography that investigators have reconstructed, she vanished somewhere along a roughly 2-mile stretch of highway in a window of about 15 minutes just before noon. 2 miles from her own front door, 15 minutes from being home. Stay with that for a moment, gently, because it is the thing that everyone who has ever looked at this case keeps circling back to. Not the dead of night, not a deserted back road, late morning on a traveled highway within sight of her own neighborhood, with people scattered all along the route. And in that thin slice of time and that short stretch of road between one ordinary sighting and the noon she had promised her mother she would beat, Tara Calico came off that road and was gone. But here is the detail that has shadowed the case from the very first hours. Tara was not riding alone in the way you might imagine a solitary cyclist. According to multiple witnesses, there was a vehicle behind her, a light-colored pickup truck described over the years as an old Ford, possibly a model from the early to mid-1950s, with a homemade camper shell fitted over the bed. And it was not passing her. It was following her, slowly, hanging back behind the bright pink bike as she rode north, keeping pace, staying close in the way that turns an ordinary truck on an ordinary road into something that makes your stomach drop. For years, that slow-moving old truck was the center of the entire investigation. Who was driving it? Why was it crawling along behind a teenage girl on a bicycle? Investigators chased that truck for decades and never definitively identified the driver. There is one small, strange, almost mundane piece of physical evidence connected to it. At a spot along 47 where the truck had reportedly been seen earlier, investigators later found an oil slick on the road. One reading of that detail, offered by investigators much later, is almost sympathetic to the driver. Maybe the truck was having engine trouble. Maybe that is why it was moving so slowly, why it lingered, why it seemed to be following her, when in fact it was just an old vehicle limping along. Maybe the man behind the wheel had nothing to do with any of it and has spent the decade since with no idea that he was ever a suspect in anything, or maybe not. That is the thing about this case. Almost every clue can be read two ways, and the truth refuses to settle. There is one more layer to that morning, and it is among the most important developments in the entire case, even though it took decades to come into focus. In recent years, as investigators went back through the old witness accounts and pushed into corners that had not been thoroughly explored, attention shifted away from the lone old truck and towards something else that had been reported on that road that day. According to the sheriff's office, a witness, described as pivotal, reported seeing 2 cars parked across the road from where Tara would have been riding, and near those cars, a group of young people. 4 or 5 young men by that account, and 1 woman. One of the men was described as tall and shirtless, waving his arms. Others appeared to be hanging back, partly hidden, behind one of the vehicles. I want to be careful and fair here, because this is exactly the kind of detail that can be made to sound more sinister than the evidence supports. And that is not what we do. We do not know with certainty that those young people had anything to do with Tara's disappearance. The witness who reported them has since died, which is part of the quiet tragedy of how long this case has dragged on. The way the people who held pieces of it keep slipping away before the whole picture can be assembled. But investigators came to believe that this group waiting along Tara's path may matter a great deal. The current working theory of the investigation, which we will come back to in detail later, leans heavily on the idea that a group of local young people, possibly close to Tara's own age, were on that road that day, that they likely knew who she was, and that a confrontation of some kind followed, the result of which, in the careful words of the lead investigator, was that Tara Calico did not survive. For now, hold both of those images in your mind, because for years they competed for the center of this story. The slow old truck with the camper shell crawling along behind the bright pink bike, and the 2 cars parked across the road, with a knot of young people waiting near them in the late morning sun. One of them, or neither of them, or some combination no one has yet reconstructed, is the last thing Tara Calico saw before her ordinary morning came apart. What we can say with confidence is painfully little. We know when she left. We know roughly when she was last seen. We know where, and we know how close to home she was. We know there was no scuffle anyone witnessed, no scream anyone reported, no crash anyone heard. We know that a road full of people somehow yielded not a single eyewitness to the actual moment she was taken. And we know that the bright pink bicycle, the one thing that should have been impossible to lose, the one thing everyone remembered, was never seen again. The noon she had promised to beat came and went. Somewhere out on Highway 47, in the clean late morning light, with golfers a few hundred yards away and hunters in the brush and ranch hands at their work, Tara Calico had already vanished. And her mother, back at the house, was beginning to glance at the clock. Noon passed, and Patty Deal did exactly what her daughter had asked her to do. When Tara was not home by the hour she had named, Patty got in her car and went looking. She knew the route. She had ridden it herself before the stalking feeling had chased her off it. So she drove 47, slowly, scanning the shoulders, the ditches, the fence lines, looking for a flash of neon pink, looking for her daughter waving her down with a flat tire and an apology. That was the version of the story she was hoping for. A breakdown, a delay, a girl walking her bike along the gravel, annoyed and fine. She drove the route and she did not find her. She drove it again. There was no pink bike on the shoulder. There was no Tara walking home. There was just the road and the heat and the growing, sickening understanding that the small instruction from that morning had been used up, that "come find me" had come true, and that finding her was not going to be simple. Patty reported her daughter missing to authorities that afternoon. By some accounts, the formal report came in around 3 in the afternoon, a few hours after the noon deadline. those few hours spent in the worst kind of hope, the kind where you are still telling yourself it is nothing, while a deeper part of you already knows. And once that report was made, the machinery of a search began to turn, slowly at first, the way these things did in 1988, and then with mounting urgency as it became clear that this was not the girl who had wandered off. Because everyone who knew Tara understood immediately how wrong this was. This was not a teenager who blew off her plans. This was the meticulous planner, the one who scheduled her hours, the one with a tennis date at 12:30 that she had every intention of keeping. People who run their lives on a tidy schedule do not simply evaporate from it. The very orderliness of Tara's life became, in those first hours, the loudest alarm of all. She had said noon, she meant noon, and noon had come and gone. Let's talk about what those first searches turned up, because it is both very little and, in one respect, deeply strange. As searchers began to comb the route, volunteers and family and eventually law enforcement moving along the shoulders of 47, they found something. Pieces of Tara's Sony Walkman and a cassette tape scattered along the road. Imagine being the person who spots that. A fragment of plastic in the dirt at the edge of the highway. A cassette out there in the scrub where no cassette should be. To Tara's mother, those fragments meant something specific and almost hopeful in its desperation. Patty came to believe that Tara had dropped them on purpose, that as she was being taken, somehow, against her will, she had the presence of mind to leave a trail, to mark the path, to scatter the only things she had so that someone who loved her might follow. It is an image of extraordinary courage, a young woman thinking clearly enough in the middle of the worst moment of her life to try to leave breadcrumbs for her mother. And it may be exactly what happened. But I have to be honest with you about this. The way the investigators eventually had to be honest about it, because the truth is more complicated and less comforting. Decades later, when the lead investigator went back through the physical evidence with fresh eyes, those recovered items did not hold up the way everyone had hoped. According to the more recent review, the cassette and the other bits recovered near the road were analyzed and found to be too old or otherwise inconsistent, not clearly belonging to Tara at all, which means the breadcrumb trail, the heartbreaking image of a daughter marking her own abduction, may not have been a trail at all. It may have been ordinary roadside debris that a frantic, grieving family understandably read as a message, because when your child is gone, you will read meaning into anything, into everything, into a scrap of plastic in the dirt. I do not say that to take the hope away. I say it because Tara deserves the truth, and so do you. Sometimes the most human thing about these cases is the way love turns noise into signal, the way a mother needs the fragments to mean her daughter fought back and tried to reach her. We can hold that tenderness and the harder fact at the same time. What the searchers did not turn up is, in the end, more important than what they did. There was no bicycle. The bright pink Huffy, the thing everyone remembered, the thing that should have been the easiest object in the world to find, was simply gone, and it has never been recovered to this day. There was no body, there was no clear crime scene, no patch of ground that said, "Here, this is where it happened." There were bicycle tire tracks in the soft sand of the shoulder, but investigators could never be sure they were hers from that day, rather than from one of her countless other rides, or from some other cyclist entirely. There was no blood, no torn clothing, no dropped shoe, none of the grim physical signature that violence usually leaves behind. There was, in the words investigators would later use, essentially zero physical evidence of an abduction. A young woman had come off a busy road in the middle of the day, and the road had kept her secret completely. In the days that followed, the search widened and deepened. This became very quickly an enormous effort. Over the course of the investigation, teams of local, state, and federal investigators would become involved, including the FBI. There were search parties on foot. There were excavations. At one point, a detective from a neighboring county brought in a cadaver dog, a search dog named Phoenix, an animal experienced enough that it had once located human remains dating back decades. That dog conducted somewhere in the range of 20 to 30 searches of the area over time. Picture that. Picture the scale of it. Dozens of searches by a dog trained to find the dead across the scrub and arroyos and rough country around Belen, because by then the people looking for Tara had begun to understand what they were almost certainly looking for. You're standing out in that country at dusk in those first weeks, the light going gold and then grey over the mesa, flashlights coming on, volunteers spread in a line, moving slowly through the brush, calling her name, scanning the ground. Patrol vehicles parked along the shoulder of 47 with their lights turning, the mountains going dark and flat against the sky, and Tara's family somewhere in the middle of it, doing the thing no parent should ever have to do, walking the desert at nightfall, hoping not to find what they are looking for and unable to stop looking. Those first 72 hours have a particular texture to them, and it is worth slowing down inside them, because they are the hours when a community discovers what it is made of. Word travels fast in a small town. By the second day, people who had only ever known Tara as a face at the bank or a figure on a bicycle were out on the roads looking for her. Belen and Rio communities are not big places, and a missing local girl is not an abstraction there. She is somebody's classmate, somebody's co-worker, somebody's neighbor's daughter. The people searching the arroyos were searching for a person they could picture, and that is both what made the effort so fierce and what made it so painful. Every searcher out in that brush was carrying a private hope and a private dread, the hope that they would be the one to find her safe, the dread that they would be the one to find her some other way. You can imagine the phone in the doll house ringing, and the way each ring would have jolted everyone in the room, that small electric hope that this would be the call, that someone had seen her, that there was news. And then the slow deflation, when the call was a friend checking in, or a reporter, or a tip that led nowhere. There is a cruelty to the early days of a case like this that people who have not lived through it rarely understand. It is not the cruelty of bad news. It is the cruelty of no news, of a silence that stretches and stretches while your mind fills it with everything imaginable. Patty later spoke about how the not knowing was its own kind of torment, worse in some ways than a terrible certainty would have been, because as long as there was no answer, there was no floor to land on, only the endless falling of a question with no bottom. And the calendar kept moving the way calendars do, indifferent to grief. The tennis date came and went unkept. The next class she was registered for met without her. The shift she was scheduled to work at the bank went uncovered. Each of those small, ordinary appointments, the ones that had made up the tidy schedule of her life, arrived on time and passed empty, and each one was a small confirmation of the thing the family could not yet say out loud. Tara kept her commitments. The schedule was a kind of promise she made to her own days, and now the schedule was breaking, one entry at a time, and the breaking of it said what no one wanted to be the first to say. Have you ever wondered what those first weeks do to a family? The way a household reorganizes itself around an absence. Patty Dole did not collapse. She did something that, in retrospect, defined the rest of her life. She got organized. She turned all of her grief and all of her formidable energy outward into the search. The Doles began doing the work themselves, organizing search parties, pushing for attention, refusing to let the case go quiet. Before it was over, they would be deputized so that they could conduct their own investigations. They would mail out, over the years, something on the order of 200,000 flyers and photographs of Tara. They would contact law enforcement agencies around the country and around the world. They prayed. They did not stop. We will come back to Patty later, to the full shape of what this search did to her and what it cost her, because her story is its own kind of tragedy folded inside Tara's. For now, it is enough to say that from those very first hours, Tara had someone who would never, ever quit. In the early going, investigators looked close to home, in the way they almost always do and almost always should. They looked at the people around Tara. They considered the slow truck. And returning to that dark thread from before, they considered the local kids, including whatever lay behind those reported threatening notes on her car. There were whispers, even then, about local boys, about whether Tara had drawn the unwanted attention of someone who would not take no for an answer. Some who knew her came to believe that she had been targeted, that this was not a stranger passing through, but something that grew out of her own community, out of the ordinary social world of a small town where everyone knows everyone. Those early suspicions never went anywhere that could be proven, but they never entirely went away either, and decades later, the investigation would circle right back to them. For now, though, in the autumn of 1988, there were no answers. There was a missing girl, a vanished pink bicycle, a scatter of debris that may or may not have meant anything, and a desert that would not give her up. The case settled into the long, grinding work of a search with no clear direction, the leads thinning out, the season turning cold. And then, the following summer, almost a year after Tara disappeared, a woman walked across a convenience store parking lot in a small town in Florida, nearly 2,000 miles away, and bent down to pick up a photograph someone had dropped on the ground. The date was June 15th, 1989. The place was Port St. Joe, Florida, a small Gulf Coast town a very long way from the high desert of New Mexico. A woman pulled into the parking lot of a convenience store, an ordinary errand on an ordinary day, and as she got out of her car, she noticed something lying on the ground in a parking space, the kind of thing your eye snags on without quite knowing why. It was a photograph, an instant photograph, a Polaroid, the sort that develops in your hand. She picked it up, and what she saw was strange enough and disturbing enough that she did not simply throw it away. The photograph showed two people, a young woman, dark-haired, and a young boy beside her. They appeared to be lying down or propped against something in what looked like the interior of a vehicle. And here is the part that made the woman's blood run cold and that has fixed this image in the public memory for more than 30 years. Both of them had their mouths covered with black duct tape. Both of them appeared to have their hands bound behind their backs. They were gagged, they were tied, and someone had taken their picture. The woman who found it remembered something else, a detail that would launch a nationwide manhunt and lead absolutely nowhere. She recalled that the parking space where the photograph lay was the same space where, when she had arrived, a van had been parked. A white windowless cargo van, a Toyota, the kind of vehicle with no side windows in the back. And she recalled the driver, a man, she said, with a mustache, who looked to be somewhere in his 30s. The van was gone now, but the photograph was there, dropped or fallen in the space the van had occupied. She took the photograph to the authorities. Police understood quickly what they might be looking at, and they moved fast. They set up roadblocks, trying to intercept a white Toyota cargo van driven by a mustached man in his 30s. They never found it. The van, the driver, and whatever connection they had to that terrible image vanished as completely as Tara had vanished from Highway 47. To this day, the man who was driving that van has never been identified. Now, there's one piece of hard technical fact attached to this photograph that you should hold on to, because it cuts against some of the wilder readings of the case. According to Polaroid officials who examined the film stock, the particular type of instant film used in that photograph was not manufactured and available until May of 1989, which means the picture could not have been taken before that. It had to have been taken sometime after May 1989, roughly 8 or 9 months after Tara disappeared. So whoever those two people were, the photograph captured them alive and bound the better part of a year after that September morning. If the woman in that picture was Tara Calico, then Tara had survived for the better part of a year in someone's captivity. That possibility, that hope and horror braided together, is the engine that drove the next phase of this entire case, because the photograph did not stay in a police file. In July of 1989, it was broadcast on national television on a program called A Current Affair, the kind of tabloid news show that millions of people watched in those years. And the moment that image went out over the airwaves, two families 2,000 miles apart sat up in their living rooms and felt the floor drop out from under them. In New Mexico, friends of Patty Dole saw the broadcast. They saw the dark-haired young woman bound and gagged in the back of that van, and they thought of Tara. They picked up their phones and they called Patty, and they told her she needed to see this photograph. And so Patty Dole, nearly a year into the worst thing that had ever happened to her, was confronted with a televised image of a bound and terrified young woman who might be her daughter. She and Tara's family met with investigators. They studied the photograph, and Patty came away convinced. She believed, with a mother's certainty, that the young woman in that picture was Tara. I want to walk through her reasons carefully, because they were not nothing, and because the way a mother reads a photograph of her possibly captive child is one of the most human and most heartbreaking things in this entire story. Patty looked at the face and made the adjustments a parent makes, accounting, as she put it, for time, for growth, for the lack of makeup, for the fact that nearly a year had passed, and that this was a girl who had been through something unimaginable. And then she pointed to the leg. There was a scar visible on the young woman's leg in the photograph, and Patty said it was identical to a scar Tara had, a mark Tara had gotten in a car accident. A scar is specific. A scar is the kind of detail a mother knows by heart. And then there was the book. Lying next to the young woman in the photograph was a paperback copy of a novel, My Sweet Audrina by V.C. Andrews, Tara's favorite book by Tara's favorite author, the detail I asked you to hold on to way back at the beginning, when it was just the ordinary literary taste of a 19-year-old girl. Think about what that does to a mother. The scar she recognized, the book she knew Tara loved, placed there in the frame as if on purpose, as if someone wanted it to be seen. To Patty, it was not a coincidence. It was a signature. It was proof. It was her daughter, alive, captive, and somehow still reaching out through the one object that said, "This is me, this is Tara, look closer." I have to slow down here and be fair to the whole truth, because this is where the case splits into two roads that have never rejoined. The presence of that book is genuinely strange, but strangeness is not proof, and a grieving mother is, with all the love in the world, not a neutral observer. The very things that made the photograph so convincing to Patty are also the things that make some investigators wary of it. A scar that resembles another scar. A book that happens to be a favorite. A face that, with enough adjustment for time and growth and the absence of makeup, could be made to resemble the face you are desperate to find. When you need something to be true badly enough, the mind is extraordinarily good at building the bridge. So the photograph was sent out for expert analysis, and this is where it gets genuinely confounding, because the experts could not agree. Scotland Yard, the famous London police service, analysed the image and concluded that the young woman was, in fact, Tara Calico. By some accounts, they put their confidence at around 85%. That is a significant finding from a serious institution. But then the Los Alamos National Laboratory, the New Mexico research facility better known for nuclear science than missing persons, conducted its own analysis and reached the opposite conclusion. A forensic scientist there said the young woman was, in their assessment, definitely not Tara. Not maybe, not probably not, but definitely not. And then the FBI examined the photograph as well, and the FBI's analysis came back inconclusive. Neither yes nor no. So there it is. 3 serious analyses, and one says yes, one says no, and one says we cannot tell. Scotland Yard, Los Alamos, and the FBI, looking at the same image, arriving at 3 different answers. More than 30 years later, the photograph from that Florida parking lot has never been conclusively identified as Tara Calico, and it has never been conclusively ruled out either. It hangs in the permanent middle the way so much of this case does. And then there is the boy, because Patty was not the only parent who saw that broadcast and recognized a child. In New Mexico, the relatives of a boy named Michael Henley also watched A Current Affair, and they looked at the young boy in the photograph, bound and gagged beside the woman, and they believed they were looking at Michael. Michael Henley had disappeared in the spring of 1988, only months before Tara, while on a hunting trip with his father, about 75 miles from where Tara was last seen. 2 New Mexico children, gone within months of each other, and now, maybe, here they both were in a single photograph, taken together in the back of a stranger's van. Michael's mother said she was almost certain the boy was her son. It is one of the cruelest turns in a case full of them, and I have to tell you how it resolved, because it tells you something important about how carefully you have to hold every piece of this story. The boy in the photograph was almost certainly not Michael Henley. We can say that with more confidence than almost anything else here, and for a tragic reason. In June of 1990, about a year after the photograph surfaced, Michael Henley's remains were found in the Zuni Mountains, roughly 7 miles from the campsite where he had wandered off. The evidence indicated that Michael had become lost and had died of exposure alone in the mountains in the spring of 1988. He had never been in anyone's van. He had never been in that photograph. He had died not long after he disappeared, a small boy lost in the wilderness, and his family's agonized certainty that they had seen him bound and alive on television had been, in the end, a mirage born of grief. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the whole lesson of the photograph in miniature. Michael Henley's family looked at that image and saw their son with the same conviction that Patty Dool saw her daughter. One of those identifications we now know was wrong, was a trick of hope and resemblance and need. And if the boy was not Michael, despite his mother being almost certain, then what does that tell us about how much weight the woman in the photograph can really bear? It does not prove the woman was not Tara, but it should make us humble about how easily love can recognize a face that is not there. To be fair to Patty and to Scotland Yard, the photograph is still genuinely unresolved, and there are people who have studied it for decades who still believe the woman could be Tara. The scar is real. The book is real. The timing, after May of 1989, is consistent with a captivity. None of that has ever been explained away, but the harder, colder reading, the one that much later investigators came to hold, is that the famous Polaroid may have had nothing to do with Tara Calico at all, that it may have been some other terrible crime, some other victims in some other state, and that its connection to Tara was a resemblance and a coincidence and a mother's desperate, understandable need. The lead investigator working the case in recent years would go so far as to say that the photograph, for all the attention it brought, ultimately pulled resources and focus away from New Mexico, away from the road where Tara actually vanished, and toward a nationwide chase that may have been chasing the wrong ghost entirely. We will probably never know. The photograph exists. The woman in it, whoever she was real and bound and frightened, and someone took her picture and then dropped it in a parking lot and drove away. Whether she was Tara, whether she lived or died, whether the man with the mustache and the white van was a kidnapper or a courier or something else, all of it remains exactly as unresolved as it was the day that woman in Port St. Joe bent down and picked it up off the ground. But here is the thing about the photograph that nobody could have predicted. It was not the end of the images. Over the years that followed, more photographs would surface, and each one would arrive at the Doyle household like a fresh wound, forcing a family to once again stare into a frame and ask the unbearable question, is that her? Is that Tara? Is my daughter in this picture? The first additional photograph appeared barely a month after the one in Florida. On the 19th of July, 1989, a photograph was found near a construction site in Montecito, California, a wealthy little community on the coast near Santa Barbara. It was blurry, much harder to read than the Florida image, but the elements were enough to make the breath catch. It showed a girl's face. There was tape across her mouth, and behind her was a length of fabric, light blue and striped, that some observers thought looked similar to a pillow or cloth visible in the original Toyota van photograph. As with the first picture, The film itself carried a date. This stock was not available until June of 1989, again placing the image well after Tara's disappearance, again consistent with someone being held alive for months. Patty Dole looked at that blurry California photograph, and once again, she saw her daughter. And this time she had specific reasons that were harder to dismiss as pure resemblance. She thought she could make out a cowlick in the girl's hair, in the same place Tara had one, that stubborn lick of hair at the temple. And she believed she could see something in the girl's eye, a hint of the condition that affected one of Tara's eyes, what is sometimes called a lazy eye, an eye that drifts. A cowlick and a wandering eye are not the kind of thing you can paint onto a stranger with wishful thinking. They are particular. They are physical. To Patty, the Montecito photograph was Tara, alive, still out there, moved now from Florida to California, still being held, still being photographed by someone who seemed to want the pictures found. Then came a third photograph, and this one was different and stranger. And to nearly everyone who has examined it, almost certainly something else entirely. It showed a woman loosely wrapped in gauze, her eyes covered with more gauze, and a pair of large black frame glasses with a man seated beside her, the two of them apparently passengers on an Amtrak train. The film used for this one was not available until February of 1990. By the standards of the case, it was the most theatrical of the three and the most suspect. Patty Dole herself thought this third image might be a hoax, a cruel piece of theater by someone who had been following the case in the media and decided to insert themselves into a family's agony for reasons known only to them. Tara's sister, looking at the set of photographs as a whole, said something that captures the impossible position the family was in. She said that the resemblances were striking, even unsettling, and that she would not rule the photographs out. But she reminded everyone that the family had been forced to examine many, many photographs over the years, and that all but those few had been ruled out. Which is to say, this was not a family that grasped at every image. They had learned, painfully, to be skeptical. And still, a few of these pictures got under their skin and stayed there. For a time, an organization that documents missing and unidentified persons maintained a case file on all three of those Polaroid photographs, treating them as a connected set, a possible thread. That file was later closed, for reasons that were never fully made clear. The photographs themselves remain some of the most discussed and least resolved images in the history of American missing persons cases. Have you ever wondered what it would do to you to be handed photograph after photograph of bound and frightened young women and asked each time whether one of them is your child, to study the curve of a stranger's jaw for the ghost of your daughter's face, to find a cowlick, an eye, a scar, and not know whether you are seeing salvation or a coincidence designed to torment you? That was Patty Dole's life. Not once, but over and over, for years. People sent her photographs, police showed her photographs, the media broadcast photographs, and every single time she had to look because what mother could refuse to look, and every single time looking cost her something she could not get back, and the photographs were only part of it, because by now the case had become something Patty had fought for, and that had also, in a way, begun to consume her. Tara's disappearance went national. The Polaroid from Florida turned a local New Mexico tragedy into a story the whole country was following. Tara Calico's name and face appeared on the biggest platforms of the era. Her case was featured on A Current Affair, on Unsolved Mysteries, on America's Most Wanted. It was profiled on the Oprah Winfrey Show and on 48 Hours. For a stretch of the late 80s and early 90s, before the names we now associate with famous missing persons cases had even entered the public consciousness, Tara Calico was one of the most recognized missing people in America. Now, attention is what every family of a missing person prays for, and Patty had fought hard to get it, but there is a shadow side to that kind of fame, and it is worth being honest about. Every time the case went out on national television, the phones at the sheriff's office in New Mexico would light up. People called from all over the country, all over the world. Some were sincere, some had real information or thought they did, some were lonely or confused or chasing the strange gravity that famous cases have, and some, over the years, called claiming to be Tara herself. Imagine answering that phone, a woman's voice on the line. This is Tara Calico. Investigators have fielded those calls for decades, each one a small cruelty, each one demanding to be checked, none of them ever turning out to be the girl from the pink bicycle. There is a quieter cost too, one the lead investigator named directly in recent years. All of that national energy, all of those resources poured into the Polaroid and the van and the man with the mustache and the calls from across the country pulled the investigation away from New Mexico, away from Highway 47, away from the 2-mile stretch of road and the 15-minute window and the group of young people that some now believe held the real answer all along. The photograph that made Tara famous may also have led the search 1,000 miles in the wrong direction and kept it there for years. That is not a criticism of Patty, who did exactly what any loving parent would do with a photograph that looked like her child. It is just one of the bitter ironies that these cases seem to generate. The thing that kept Tara's name alive may also be the thing that kept her lost. The photographs did not stop with those first 3 either. They trickled in for years. And then, 2 decades after the Florida Polaroid, the case produced one more strange flurry of images, this time aimed not at the family, but at the town where it all began on the Gulf Coast. In the summer of 2009, the police chief in Port St. Joe, Florida, the same small town where the original photograph had been found 20 years earlier, began receiving letters in the mail. They were postmarked from Albuquerque, New Mexico. One of them contained a photograph, printed on plain copy paper, of a young boy with sandy brown hair, and someone had taken a pen and drawn a black band across the boy's mouth, exactly mimicking the duct tape gag from the famous 1989 Polaroid. A second letter arrived with an original image of the boy, and a few days later, a newspaper in Port St. Joe received a third letter, also postmarked Albuquerque, with the same image, the same black band inked over the child's mouth. None of the letters contained a return address. None of them contained a note explaining who the boy was or what the sender wanted. Just the images, mailed across the country from New Mexico to the very town where the original photograph had surfaced, as if someone were drawing a deliberate line between the two. To this day, no one knows who sent those letters, or who the boy in them is, or whether the images had any genuine connection to Tara's case at all. The photographs were turned over to the FBI in the hope that fingerprints or DNA might be recovered from them. But the timing was strange in another way too, because the letters arrived at roughly the same moment that a self-described psychic contacted authorities about Tara. This caller said she had once known a runaway out in California, a young woman she had worked alongside, who was later murdered, and that she had begun having dreams suggesting this runaway might have been Tara, perhaps buried somewhere in California. Searches followed, and they found nothing. The psychic's dreams led nowhere, and the anonymous letters led nowhere, and the case absorbed them both, the way it absorbed everything, without ever quite closing around an answer. By the early 90s then, this was the shape of Tara Calico's case, a disappearance with no crime scene and no body, a famous photograph that might be her and might be a stranger that one agency said was her and another said definitely was not, a scatter of additional images, each one a fresh wound, a family that had become, in the truest sense, professional searchers, deputized and tireless and slowly being worn down by the very thing keeping them going. And underneath all of it, back in New Mexico, the original questions sitting unanswered exactly where they had been left on that warm September morning. Who was in the slow old truck? Who were the young people parked across the road? What happened in those 15 minutes on those 2 miles of highway so close to home? To make sense of all of it, we have to set the photographs aside for a while, as hard as that is, and go back to the road. Because over the decades, investigators developed not one theory of what happened to Tara Calico, but several. And they do not all point in the same direction. Before we walk through what investigators have believed over the years, I want to set one ground rule, because it matters more in this case than in almost any other. No one has ever been charged with a crime in connection with Tara Calico's disappearance, not one person. Every name that has ever been whispered, every theory that has ever been floated, every suspect who has ever been considered exists in the realm of suspicion and unproven belief, and the people involved are entitled to the presumption of innocence in the fullest sense of that phrase. As we go through this, I am going to keep reminding you of that, not as a legal formality, but because real people's lives sit underneath these theories, and because Tara deserves a true accounting, not a satisfying one. With that held firmly in mind, let's talk about the possibilities. The first theory is the one the photograph points to: the stranger. The idea that Tara was taken by someone passing through, someone with no connection to Belen at all, and carried away into a captivity that the Polaroids may or may not document. In this version, the slow white van in Florida and the man with the mustache are the thread, and Tara was a victim of the kind of long-distance predatory abduction that does terribly happen. The appeal of this theory is the photograph itself, and the months of survival it would imply, and the awful hope folded into that. The problem with this theory is everything else. There is no evidence connecting that van or that man to New Mexico. The Polaroid has never been confirmed to be Tara, and one serious laboratory said it definitely was not. And the geography is hard. A stranger passing through that specific 2-mile stretch of rural highway at that specific 15-minute window and successfully abducting a fit, fast young woman off a bicycle in broad daylight with golfers and hunters and ranch hands all around without anyone seeing the actual moment is not impossible, but it asks a great deal of coincidence. For years, though, the stranger theory held the public imagination precisely because of that photograph. The second theory is the one that dominated the case for a long stretch in the 2000s, and it came from inside law enforcement. Around 2008, The sheriff of Valencia County at the time, a man named René Rivera, who had worked the case for years, went public with a striking claim. He said he believed he knew what had happened to Tara. In his telling, she was not taken by a stranger at all. She was killed by local young men, people who knew her. According to Rivera's theory, 2 teenage boys, possibly with a couple of others involved, drove up behind Tara in a truck that morning, and there was some kind of accident. He suggested the boys may have struck her or caused her to crash, and that in the panic that followed, Tara died, and those responsible covered it up, with help, he believed, from families in the community who had the standing to make a problem disappear. Rivera said flatly that he knew the names of the people involved, but he also said that without a body, without physical evidence, he could not build a case that would hold up. So he named no one publicly, and he made no arrest. That decision caused real pain and real friction. Tara's stepfather, John Dole, pushed back hard, and you can understand why. From the family's point of view, if the sheriff genuinely knew who was responsible, then saying so out loud while doing nothing about it was its own kind of cruelty. John Dole argued that strong circumstantial evidence ought to be enough to bring a case, and that announcing a theory without an arrest just left the family hanging, gave them a wound without a remedy. To be fair to Sheriff Rivera, the legal reality of trying to charge a homicide with no body and no physical evidence, decades after the fact, against suspects who had stayed silent for years, is genuinely difficult, and prosecutors are right to be cautious about cases they cannot prove. But to be fair to the Doles, it is hard to imagine anything more agonizing than being told that someone in authority believes they know who killed your daughter and that nothing is going to be done about it. Both of those things can be true at once, and in this case, they were. This second theory, the local hit-and-run cover-up, has a quieter cousin that some of Tara's own friends have voiced over the years. There were people close to Tara who came to believe that she had been targeted, that a local boy or a group of local boys had set their sights on her, and that the disappearance grew out of that unwanted attention, perhaps after Tara rejected someone. In this reading, those threatening notes on her car months earlier were not random pranks at all. They were a warning sign that got missed. One of Tara's childhood friends has spent years pursuing this theory and pushing the case back into public view, convinced that the answer was always local, always close, always known to people who chose to stay quiet. Again, none of this has been proven, and the specific individuals remain unnamed and uncharged and entitled to that presumption of innocence. But it is a theory rooted in the people who actually knew Tara and knew the town, and it has proven remarkably durable. Which brings us to the third theory, the current one, the one the investigation is built around today, and it is essentially a refinement of that second idea, sharpened by years of fresh work. Investigators in recent years came to focus less on the lone old truck and more on that group of young people reportedly seen parked across the road, the 2 cars, the 4 or 5 young men, the 1 woman, the tall, shirtless figure waving his arms. The working theory now is that a group of locals, possibly close to Tara's own age, were on that road that morning, that they very likely knew who she was, and that they seized the moment as she rode back toward home. In the careful words the lead investigator has used, a confrontation of some kind took place between Tara and that group, the result of which was that Tara Calico did not survive. Investigators have said They believe they know in broad strokes what happened and who was involved. Whether they can ever prove it is a different and much harder question, one we will come to. I want to handle the next part with particular care because it involves a name that carries enormous weight and a great deal of horror, and it would be easy to misuse it. In their long search for Tara's remains, investigators in recent years began examining some abandoned mines south of where she vanished. Those particular mines, it turns out, had been leased decades earlier, back in the 1950s, by the family of a man named David Parker Ray. If you know that name, you know it for terrible reasons. David Parker Ray was a New Mexico man who, in the late 1990s, was arrested and convicted in connection with the kidnapping and torture of women at a property near Elephant Butte Lake. He died in prison in 2002 while serving a sentence of more than 200 years. He is believed by some to have claimed a large number of victims, though no bodies were ever conclusively tied to him. Here is the crucial thing, and I want to be absolutely clear about it, because this is exactly the kind of detail that gets twisted in the retelling. David Parker Ray is not a suspect in Tara Calico's disappearance. Investigators do not believe he took her. The reasoning is straightforward. At the time Tara vanished in 1988, Ray is believed to have been living in Phoenix, Arizona, not in New Mexico. The connection to his name is purely geographic and purely incidental. It is simply that his family once held the lease on some old mines in the area, and one of those mines later drew the attention of investigators for reasons that have nothing to do with Ray himself. I am telling you this so that when you hear his name attached to this case, you understand exactly what the link is and is not. It is a coincidence of property records, not a theory of the crime. To let David Parker Ray's reputation bleed into Tara's story as if he were responsible would be both false and unfair. And it is the kind of easy, lurid mistake this case does not need. So those are the roads, the stranger and the van and the photograph, the local hit and run and the cover-up, the group of young people on the road, and the confrontation that followed. Over the decades, investigators have done the patient, unglamorous work of closing off the wrong roads, and it is worth knowing who has been ruled out, because the ruling out is its own kind of evidence. The FBI and other investigators cleared Tara's family. They cleared her known friends. They cleared several men who had dated her or shown a romantic interest in her, including, one assumes, the boyfriend she was supposed to play tennis with that afternoon, a former county sheriff and his son, both of whom had at various points drawn suspicion, were also eventually set aside as persons of interest. The son had died by suicide in 1991, and over the years his name had floated through the rumor mill, but investigators came to no longer consider either man a suspect. One by one, the obvious answers were tested and discarded, until what remained was the harder, closer, more uncomfortable possibility that the answer had been local and known all along. There is a cruel mechanical problem sitting underneath all of this, and you need to understand it to understand why, even now, no one has been charged. Because of the way the law works, and because of how much time has passed, the statute of limitations has run out on most of the crimes that could possibly be charged in connection with Tara's disappearance. What that means, in practical terms, is that prosecutors today can really only pursue the most serious charges, first-degree murder and certain sex offenses, the crimes that have no time limit. Everything lesser, every charge that might have been easier to prove, like a cover-up or an accident or a failure to report, is simply off the table now. Too much time has passed, so the investigation is not just trying to figure out what happened, it is trying to prove the very gravest version of what happened to the highest legal standard decades after the fact, with no body and almost no physical evidence. That is a steep hill. It may be the steepest hill in the entire case, and yet, against all of that, the investigation did not die. In fact, after years of going cold, it came roaring back to life. To understand how, we need to talk about the people who refused to let Tara Calico become just another name in a file. For a while, in the mid-1990s and into the early 2000s, Tara's case did what most cold cases do. It cooled. The national television appearances slowed and then stopped. The photographs stopped surfacing for a time. The phone calls thinned out. The leads that had seemed so urgent in the early going hardened into a thick case file and went quiet. This is the part of these stories that never makes the documentaries. The long, grey years when nothing happens, when a missing person is neither found nor forgotten, but simply suspended, when the world moves on and a family is left standing in the same spot, still waiting. But the legal system did move, in one significant way. In 1998, 10 years after Tara vanished, a New Mexico judge formally declared her to be deceased. And the ruling went further than a simple declaration of death. The judge ruled that Tara's death was a homicide. Think about what that meant for the family. On one hand, it was an acknowledgement, a court of law stating plainly what nearly everyone close to the case had come to believe, that Tara had not run away, had not had an accident, had not simply gotten lost, but had been killed. On the other hand, it was the official death of hope, the legal end of the possibility that Tara might walk back through the door on that pink bicycle. For a mother like Patty, who never truly stopped believing her daughter might be alive somewhere, that ruling must have been both a validation and a wound. The state was saying your daughter was murdered, and it was saying it without being able to tell her by whom. The case sat largely dormant until around 2013. That year, on the 25th anniversary of Tara's disappearance, a 6-person task force was assembled to reinvestigate the case from the ground up. This was the beginning of the modern era of the investigation, the slow turning over of every old stone. That task force, and the investigators who followed it, would eventually interview more than 100 potential witnesses. They would conduct numerous excavations across Valencia County, digging at sites where tips or hunches or the passage of time suggested Tara's remains might lie. They searched a pond and a lagoon and a rock quarry. They searched under concrete slabs poured at various properties. They followed a tip from a woman who said she had heard the sound of digging the day after Tara disappeared at a spot a few miles south of Belen, and they brought in heavy equipment and excavated the ground. None of it produced Tara, but it produced something almost as important. It produced momentum. The case was alive again. In 2016, a Valencia County Sheriff's investigator named Joseph Rowland took over the Calico case from that multi-agency task force, and Rowland, by every account, made it personal in the way the best cold case investigators do. For him, the goal was never abstract. It was not closing a file or clearing a statistic. It was, in his own words, bringing Tara Calico home. He has spoken about how the case pulls at the heart, about the duty he feels not just to solve it, but to physically recover Tara, to give her family and her community the one thing they have never had, which is her. That kind of personal commitment is what keeps a decades-old case from dying. It needs a person who simply will not let go. In 2019, the FBI raised the public profile of the case again, announcing a reward of up to $20,000 for precise information leading to the identification or location of Tara and to the arrest and conviction of whoever was responsible. A reward like that does two things. It can shake loose information from people who have been sitting on it, and it signals publicly that the federal government still considers this an active and important case more than 30 years on. The machine was running again, and it was about to make its biggest leap forward in decades. The breakthrough, when it came, did not come from a dramatic confession or a body in the desert. It came from a careful, methodical review of the entire case by an outside set of eyes. Around 2020, Rowland's team received the results of a roughly 2-year analysis of the criminal case conducted by a non-profit organization called the Rocky Mountain Information Network, a group that helps law enforcement agencies work through complex investigations. That analysis recommended pursuing about half a dozen loose ends, threads in the old case file that had never been fully pulled. And one of those recommendations stood out, both for what it said and for what was hidden about it. When the analysis was eventually released publicly, in a redacted form, most of it was readable. But one recommendation had been heavily blacked out, far more than the others. That recommendation, according to the sheriff's office, was to go back and re-interview a particular person, someone who had previously claimed to know nothing at all about Tara's disappearance. The fact that this single recommendation was so heavily redacted, while the others were largely visible, was itself a kind of signal. You do not black out the name of someone who is irrelevant. The redaction was, in effect, an indication that the person who once professed to know nothing had become a credible suspect. Someone who had been hiding in plain sight, dismissed early on, was suddenly at the center of the case. Acting on those recommendations, the investigative team, including 2 FBI polygraph examiners, traveled out of state to conduct interviews. Rowland has been careful never to say exactly where they went or whom they spoke to, but he described the direction as something genuinely new, a thread that had never been thoroughly explored before. They were, as he put it, unraveling a thread, and whatever they learned in those out-of-state interviews was significant enough to change the trajectory of the entire case. The information they gathered was enough to convince a New Mexico district judge, about 6 months later, to approve a search warrant. And in April of 2021, investigators executed that warrant at a private residence in Valencia County. What they were looking for, what they found, and whose home it was, we do not know, because a state district judge sealed it all. The search warrant, the results of the search, and all the documents related to the new suspects were placed under seal and have remained there ever since. That same year, the sheriff's office confirmed publicly that they had a new lead and that a sealed warrant had been executed at an undisclosed residence, but they offered no details. The case had clearly turned a corner. The public just was not allowed to see around it. And then came the announcement that made national news again. On the 13th of June, 2023, the Valencia County Sheriff, Denise Vigil, held a press conference alongside representatives of the FBI. Tara's sister was there, and the sheriff said something that Tara's family had been waiting 35 years to hear. She said that law enforcement now believed there was sufficient evidence to submit the investigation to the district attorney's office for review of potential charges. They had persons of interest. They had followed up, she said, on all the theories, all the leads, all the tips, and they were sending the entire case file to the prosecutors. The identities of the persons of interest, she said, were sealed by the court and would remain sealed until a court ordered otherwise. For the family, after 3.5 decades, it was the closest they had ever come to the possibility of justice. Investigators were even quoted around that time, saying they were working to arrest the people responsible. And then, nothing. That is the hard truth of where this case sits. And I am not going to dress it up for you. More than 2 years have now passed since that hopeful press conference. The case went to the office of the district attorney for the 13th Judicial District. Prosecutors there assembled a team of attorneys to work through 35 years' worth of files to decide whether there was enough to criminally charge anyone. And as of the most recent reporting, in the autumn of 2025, no charges have been filed. But neither has the case been formally declined. It sits, in the lead investigator's word, in limbo. The investigators believe they have probable cause. But probable cause, the standard that lets police make an arrest, is a lower bar than the standard prosecutors need to actually win a conviction, which is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And bridging that gap in a 37-year-old case with no body, no crime scene, and almost no physical evidence against suspects who have stayed silent for a lifetime is exactly as hard as it sounds. There is a line the lead investigator said that I cannot stop thinking about because it captures the quiet desperation of this stage of the case. He pointed out that as more time passes, they are losing more evidence than they are gaining, and he meant it literally. Several of the people interviewed over the years have already died. One of them was that pivotal eyewitness, the one who reported the 2 cars and the group of young people parked across the road, a person whose testimony might have been central to any trial, now gone, taking whatever they truly knew with them. Every year that the case sits in limbo, another potential witness ages, another memory fades, another person who could have spoken slips beyond reach. The investigators raced for decades to build a case, and now they are watching it quietly erode while it waits on a prosecutor's desk. So the people who refused to let Tara be forgotten did their part. They built the case. They named the suspects to themselves, even if not to us. They got it to the doorstep of a courtroom. And there it has stalled, agonizingly, with the family that started all of this no longer around to see it. Because by the time the case finally broke, the 2 people who had fought hardest and longest for Tara were already gone. But the search for Tara herself, for her physical remains, for the chance to finally bring her home, has never stopped. And in recent years, it has led investigators to one last, strange, and oddly hopeful place, the bottom of an abandoned mine. To understand why investigators are now focused on a hole in the ground north of Belen, you have to go back to a small observation made more than 25 years ago, one of those loose threads that hangs in a case file for decades before anyone has the means to pull it. In 1998, In the course of searching for the possible victims of other crimes in the region, a New Mexico State Police investigator asked an expert from New Mexico Tech to examine some old mines in the area. There were 4 of them, abandoned mine shafts that had been leased back in the 1950s. The expert went and looked, and he found something about one of them that did not sit right. This particular shaft had originally been dug to a depth of about 60 feet, but when the expert examined it, he found that about 30 feet down, the shaft was clogged. It was choked with rocks and rubble, as if the lower half of the mine had been deliberately collapsed. In his assessment, it looked like someone had intentionally caved in the mine shaft, possibly to cover something up. That is the kind of observation that should set off every alarm in an investigation. A mine that someone appears to have collapsed on purpose in a region where a young woman vanished without a trace. But here is what happened to that lead, and it tells you something quietly maddening about how these cases actually go. It never got fully investigated, not because anyone thought it was unimportant, but because it was not cost-effective. Excavating 30 feet of deliberately collapsed rock and rubble out of an unstable, decades-old mine shaft is dangerous, slow, and expensive. And in 1998, there was no money and no clear enough reason to do it. So the observation was written down, and the mine was left alone, and the thread hung there in the file for the better part of 3 decades. The lead investigator on Tara's case, Joseph Rowland, did not want to let it hang any longer. To him, a possibly collapsed mine shaft, a relatively short distance from where Tara was last seen, was not a thread he was willing to ignore, however inconvenient it might be. And so, in recent years, he set about the painstaking work of actually getting into that mine. It is worth understanding just how much effort that took, because it is a measure of how seriously this investigation now treats the search for Tara's remains. You cannot simply walk up to a 100-year-old mine shaft and start digging. It took something like 4 years just to render the mine safe enough for further exploration. There was an environmental dimension as well, because abandoned mines are often home to bats, and a scientific study of the mine's bat population had to be conducted before anyone could disturb it. Rowland also consulted with a national non-profit organization made up of volunteer specialists who help law enforcement locate clandestine graves and recover human remains, the kind of experts who know how to read the ground for the dead. Slowly, methodically, over years, the pieces were put in place to finally look inside the one mine shaft that a quarter century earlier had not looked right. Now, I told you earlier about the strange and entirely incidental connection between these mines and the name David Parker Ray, and I want to hold to that same care here. These 4 mines had been leased decades ago by Ray's family, and the property sits some distance south of where Tara was last seen. But Ray is not a suspect in Tara's case, and investigators do not believe he was involved, in part because he is thought to have been living in Arizona at the time she vanished. The mine is being searched not because of Ray, but because of that 25-year-old observation that one of the shafts appeared to have been deliberately collapsed. The history of the property is a footnote, not a theory. I keep returning to that distinction because this is exactly the kind of detail that gets distorted in the retelling, and Tara's story does not need borrowed horror. It has enough weight of its own. And then there is the detail from the most recent reporting that is so humble, so low-tech, and so quietly determined that it has stayed with me since I first read it. While waiting on the funding and the engineering required for a full excavation, the investigator turned to a tool that cost about $12. Fly traps. He placed a set of inexpensive fly traps down in the mine. The reasoning is grim but sound. There are certain species of insects known to feed on human remains at different stages of decomposition. And if there were remains somewhere in that collapsed shaft, the right traps might catch the kind of insects that would only be there for one reason. It is the sort of idea that sounds almost too simple, and it captures something about this whole investigation, the way it has come down after 37 years and 100 witnesses and federal involvement and sealed warrants and national television, to a single dedicated man driving back from a conference, stopping off at an abandoned mine to check a set of $12 fly traps, still trying, after all this time, to find a girl who disappeared before some of the investigators on the case were even born. The results of those traps were still pending as of the most recent reporting. The next step, if the funding comes through, may be to drill core samples down into the collapsed portion of the shaft, to bring up material from below and examine it for any trace of what might be buried there. As of the autumn of 2025, no remains had been found. The mine had not given up an answer, but it had not been ruled out either. Like the photograph, like the truck, like the group on the road, it sits in that same permanent middle ground, a possibility neither confirmed nor closed. You're standing at the mouth of that mine on a cold desert morning, the hills rolling away brown and bare in every direction, the wind moving over the scrub, a dark opening in the ground that has kept whatever secret it holds for more than 3 decades, and a handful of people standing around it, waiting on insects and funding and core samples, doing the slow, unglamorous, almost unbearable work of hope, because somewhere, maybe down there, maybe somewhere else entirely, is a young woman that an entire community has refused to stop looking for. When asked about all of it, about the limbo at the district attorney's office, about the evidence eroding year by year, about whether the case will ever truly be solved, Roland said something that I think is the most honest summary of where things stand. He said the case will not be solved until he gets Tara Calico home, not until there is an arrest, not until there is a conviction. Home. That is the mission, as he defined it, because for the people closest to this case, the deepest wound was never really the lack of a name to charge, painful as that is. It was the absence of Tara herself. A family that buried a legal declaration of death in 1998, but never got to bury their daughter. A grave with no one in it. A question that, after 37 years, still does not have a body to lay to rest. And that brings us, finally, to the people who carried this loss the longest, to the mother who never stopped searching, and the family who lived their entire lives inside the shape of Tara's absence. Because if this story belongs to anyone, it belongs to them. When you read about a case like this, it is easy to let the famous parts swallow the human ones. The Polaroid becomes the story, the van, the analyses, the sealed warrants, the mine shaft. But none of that is why this case matters. It matters because a 19-year-old went out for a bike ride and did not come home, and because the people who loved her spent the rest of their lives in the long shadow that absence cast. So let's talk about them. Let's talk about what it actually costs to lose someone this way, and to keep loving them anyway. Start with Patty Dole, Tara's mother. From the very first afternoon, when she drove that highway looking for a flash of pink and found nothing, Patty did not retreat into private grief. She went to war. There is no other honest way to describe it. She became, in the words of one reporter who covered her for years, a force of nature. She organized search parties. She and the family pushed relentlessly for media attention, and they got it, landing Tara's story on the biggest national programs of the era, on Oprah, on America's Most Wanted, on 48 Hours, on Unsolved Mysteries. They had themselves deputized so that they could legally conduct their own investigations, chasing leads that law enforcement could not or would not chase. They mailed out over the years something on the order of 200,000 flyers and photographs of Tara, sending her face to police departments and to strangers across the country and around the world. They contacted law enforcement agencies in other states and other nations. They prayed. And they did all of it for years, then for decades, with the kind of stamina that only a parent who cannot let go could possibly sustain. You have to understand what that does to a person over time. Patty's husband, John Dole, Tara's stepfather, would later say plainly that the search contributed to Patty's failing health. The work of looking for a lost child is not a sprint that you recover from. It is a slow burning of yourself for fuel, year after year, with no rest and no resolution, because the case never closes and the hope never quite dies, and so you can never quite stop. Every televised photograph that might be Tara meant Patty had to look. Every phone call from someone claiming to be Tara or to know where Tara was meant Patty had to hope, and then, almost always, to grieve again. Imagine living inside that cycle for 18 years. Imagine the toll. And through all of it, Patty held on to something that the rest of the world had mostly let go of. She believed Tara was coming back, not as a metaphor. She believed her daughter had survived whatever took her that morning, that she was out there somewhere, and that one day she would return. A reporter who knew her wrote that for Patty, every girl, every woman, everyone who rode past on a bicycle was always, for one heart-stopping second, Tara. Nearly 18 years after that September morning, and still, a bicycle going by could stop her breath. John Dole put it simply. Tara, he said, was always coming back. Patty was looking for Tara right to the end. The end came in May of 2006. By then, John had built Patty a home she had dreamed of, a house on the water down in Port Charlotte, Florida, where the couple had moved a few years earlier. It was supposed to be her dream home. She died there at the age of 64, of complications from a series of strokes. She had spent nearly 18 years searching for her daughter, and she died without ever knowing what had happened to her, without ever bringing Tara home, with the case still open and the questions still unanswered and the pink bicycle still missing somewhere out in the world. John said that Patty always dreamed of the day they would be reunited with Tara. She did not get that day. What she got was 18 years of looking, and then she was gone, and the looking passed to others. She was not the only parent this case took. Tara's father, David Calico, who had divorced Patty years before, also died without answers, and his death carried its own separate cruelty. In 2002, David Calico was attacked, beaten and mugged by two men in Albuquerque. He died from his injuries at the age of 64, the same age his former wife would reach when she died 4 years later. Two parents, both gone in their 60s, both having lost a daughter to a mystery, one of them then lost to a violent crime of his own. There is no neat meaning to be made of that. It is just the kind of accumulating grief that these cases leave in their wake, the way a single act of violence on a desert road in 1988 kept reaching forward through the years, taking more, costing more, long after the morning it began. But the loss did not only take, it also, in a way that I find genuinely moving, summoned people. Because as Patty's generation passed, a younger one picked up the search. One of the most important figures in keeping Tara's case alive in recent years has been a woman named Melinda Esquibel, who knew Tara as a child. Esquibel made the case something close to a life's mission. She has worked to push it back into the public eye, to organize information, to keep pressure on the authorities, to make sure that millions of new eyes might land on the story and that someone, somewhere, might finally say what they know. She has been openly critical of how the case was handled over the years, calling it, in her words, a real injustice within the local sheriff's office. She has subscribed to the theory that a group of local boys stalked Tara and that she was targeted after rejecting one of them. And while that theory remains unproven, and the people it implicates remain unnamed and entitled to the presumption of innocence, Esquibel's refusal to let the case fade is part of why it broke open again at all. Sometimes a case survives not because of the institutions, but because one person who loved the victim simply will not allow the world to forget, and the town remembered too. Belen is not a place that easily forgets its own. Over the decades, Tara's name has been kept alive by family, by classmates, by teachers, by neighbors, by people who were children when she vanished and are now grandparents. There have been vigils, there have been memorial runs and rides, there have been quiet conversations in shops and kitchens that amount to a kind of communal vow, a refusal to let her become just a name on an old flyer. In a landscape like central New Mexico, where the roads run long and the horizons run longer, the land itself seems to teach a kind of patience, and patience is exactly what a case like this demands. The vigil is not passive. It is an insistence on a possibility, the possibility that someone, somewhere, still knows something specific about a particular 15 minutes on a particular September morning, and that telling it, even now, even after all this time, would still matter. Have you ever wondered what the people who do know are carrying? Because if the investigators are right, if the answer really was local all along, then there are people out there who have lived their entire adult lives with this, people who are young in 1988 and are old now, people who have raised families, held jobs, gone to funerals, grown grey, all while carrying the knowledge of what happened on that road and where Tara is and who did it. The statute of limitations may have run out on some of what they did, but there is no statute of limitations on what a thing like that does to a person on the inside, in the quiet, at night. The investigators are losing witnesses to old age and death every year, which means that somewhere the clock is running out not just on the case, but on the chance for anyone who knows to finally set it down before they take it to their own grave. That is where the living part of this story rests now. The parents are gone. The investigator is still checking his fly traps. The friend is still pushing. The town is still remembering. And the case sits on a prosecutor's desk, waiting, while the people who could answer it grow older and fewer. After 37 years, the most meaningful thing left in the entire case may simply be the possibility that someone is finally ready to talk. So let's end where we should have always kept our eyes, not on the mystery, on Tara. Before we close, I want to sit for a while with the questions themselves because they are the real legacy of this case, and because there is something clarifying about laying them out plainly, side by side, without trying to force them into an answer. These are not manufactured mysteries. They are genuine, stubborn gaps in the record, and any honest telling of Tara's story has to hold them up to the light. Start with the bicycle. Of everything that vanished that morning, the pink Huffy is the detail that has always bothered me most. A body can be hidden. A young woman can be carried away in a vehicle in seconds, but a full-sized adult bicycle, bright neon pink with yellow cables, is a large, awkward, unmistakable object. Whoever took Tara also took the bike, or disposed of it, completely and permanently, in a way that 37 years of searching has never undone. If she was struck by a vehicle, the bike should have been part of the wreckage. If she was pulled into a van by a stranger, why take the bike at all? And why so thoroughly that it never turned up in a ditch or an arroyo or a dump anywhere? The vanished bicycle is a small thing, but small things are often where the truth hides, and this one has never been explained. Then there is the absence of a crime scene, which a New Mexico State Police crash expert found genuinely hard to reconcile with some of the theories. Think about what it would take to abduct or kill someone on that road and leave nothing. No blood. No scuffle marks anyone could identify. No debris from a collision. No torn clothing. No dropped possessions that clearly belonged to her, on a road where, within minutes, people were driving past, hunting in the brush, working the ranches, and playing golf a few hundred yards away. The crash expert specifically doubted the idea that Tara was simply hit by a car, accidentally or on purpose, because a collision violent enough to kill or disable her would have scattered pieces of a vehicle and a bicycle across the road, and cleaning that up quickly, unseen, in the middle of a busy late morning, would have been extraordinarily difficult. And yet she was gone. Whatever happened, it happened fast, and it happened clean, and that combination is rare and unsettling. Have you ever wondered how the two leading versions of that morning can both be true at once when they seem to contradict each other? Because for years, there were really two competing pictures. The old man in the slow truck with the homemade camper shell, and the group of young people parked across the road. Investigators chased the truck for decades and never identified the driver, and then, more recently, came to believe the truck may have been a red herring, just an old vehicle with engine trouble, explaining the oil slick and the slow pace. The driver perhaps entirely innocent and entirely unaware that he was ever suspected of anything. The newer focus on the group of young people fits the local theory better, but the honest answer is that we still do not know which of those two images, if either, was the danger, and which was just background noise on an ordinary road. One of them may have been the last innocent face Tara saw. The other may have been the people who took her life, and we cannot, even now, say for certain which was which. Then there is the photograph, which deserves one last honest accounting. After everything, after Scotland Yard's qualified yes and Los Alamos' firm no, and the FBI's shrug, the most likely conclusion that experienced investigators have reached is that the famous Polaroid probably had nothing to do with Tara at all, that it documented some other terrible crime, some other frightened young woman, and that its resemblance to Tara was a coincidence amplified by a mother's need and a nation's attention. If that is true, then one of the most iconic images in the history of American missing persons cases is not actually a picture of the person it made famous. And the woman in that photograph, whoever she was, is her own separate unsolved tragedy, bound and gagged in the back of a van, photographed by a man who was never found, dropped in a parking lot, and then erased from the record as completely as Tara was erased from that road. We do not even know her name. We may never know whether she lived. That is its own quiet horror, sitting just to the side of Tara's, easy to forget because we were all so busy asking whether she was someone else. And finally, there is the cruelest gap of all, the one between knowing and proving, because the people closest to this case will tell you carefully that they believe they know what happened to Tara Calico. They believe a confrontation took place on that road with a group of local young people who knew her, and that she did not survive it. They have persons of interest. They have names sealed in a courthouse. They have probable cause. And still, after 37 years, no one has been charged, because believing is not the same as proving, and a 37-year-old homicide with no body and no crime scene is one of the hardest things in the world to take into a courtroom and win. The statute of limitations has quietly closed the door on every charge except the gravest ones. The witnesses are dying. The evidence, as the lead investigator said, is being lost faster than it is found. We may be in the strange and terrible situation where the truth is essentially known, and the law may never be able to act on it. That is not a satisfying place to leave a story. But it is, as best anyone can tell, the truth, and Tara is owed the truth more than she is owed a tidy ending. You're back on Highway 47 now, in your mind, on a warm September morning in 1988. The light is clean and white. There's heat coming off the blacktop. A pink bicycle is moving north along the shoulder, fast and easy. A young woman on it with headphones in, and a tennis date that afternoon, and a mother at home who will start watching the clock around noon. She is 2 miles from her own front door. She has 15 minutes left of being a person the world can still find. And somewhere ahead of her on that ordinary road, in the ordinary sunlight, is the thing none of us can see. The thing that took her so cleanly that nearly 4 decades of searching has not brought her back. We do not get to follow her around the bend. No one ever has. That is where the road keeps its secret, and that is where, with as much care as we can manage, we have to let the questions rest and turn, at the last, back toward the person at the center of all of it. There is a question worth asking gently before we say goodbye to Tara. Why this case? Thousands of people go missing every year. Most of their names never travel beyond their own towns. And yet Tara Calico's name traveled across the country and around the world, onto the biggest television programs of her era, into the files of Scotland Yard, into a research laboratory better known for nuclear physics, and it is still being spoken now, 37 years later, by podcasters and filmmakers and investigators and people like us tonight. Part of the answer is the photograph, of course, but part of it is something about the time she disappeared into, and I think understanding that time helps us understand why she was never found. Tara vanished in the autumn of 1988, and it is worth remembering how different the world was for a missing person then. There were no cell phones in the pockets of those deer hunters and ranch hands and golfers, no way for any of them to snap a photo of a suspicious truck or call in a license plate in real time. There were no Amber Alerts, the rapid public broadcast system that would not exist for years yet, born out of a different child's tragedy. There was no national DNA database of the kind investigators rely on now, no easy way to run a sample against millions of records, no genetic genealogy of the sort that has cracked open so many cold cases in the last decade. The forensic tools that we now take for granted, the ones that can pull a profile from a few cells and a name from a distant cousin's spit in a mailed-away kit, simply did not exist in any usable form in 1988. A young woman could come off a road, and the science that might have caught her abductor was still years or decades from being invented, which is to say, in a strange and sad way, that Tara's case came too early. It arrived just before the tools that might have solved it. If the same crime happened today, there would be cameras on the highway, phones in every car, a forensic apparatus that could wring evidence out of almost nothing. In 1988, there was a pink bicycle, a scatter of debris that might not even have been hers, a road full of witnesses who saw everything except the one thing that mattered, and a set of investigative techniques that, for all the effort and sincerity behind them, were simply not equal to a clean, fast disappearance in broad daylight. The investigators of that era did not fail for lack of caring. Many of them cared enormously, and some carried this case for the rest of their careers. They failed in part because the future had not arrived yet, and Tara could not wait for it. And there is a painful corollary to that, which is that the tools did eventually arrive, and they still have not been enough. We live now in the age of the genetic genealogy breakthrough, the era when decades-old cases fall, one after another, to a database and a family tree. Yet Tara's case has not fallen that way, and the reason is brutally simple. Those techniques need something to work with. They need remains. They need a sample. They need the physical fact of the victim or of the crime to exist somewhere that science can reach it. And in Tara's case, there is no body. There has never been a body. The single thing that modern forensics most needs is the single thing this case has never been able to provide. It is why that collapsed mineshaft matters so much, why a dedicated investigator will spend 4 years and a set of $12 fly traps trying to see what lies 30 feet down in the dark. Because finding Tara would not just bring her home, it might finally give the science something to hold. There is another reason her story stayed with us, and it is less about forensics and more about what she came to represent. When Tara disappeared, the modern era of the high-profile missing persons case had not really begun. The names that so many of us now associate with that genre, the ones that dominated cable news in the late 1990s and the 2000s, came later. Tara came before them. For a stretch of years, she was one of the most recognized missing people in America, and her case helped teach the country a grammar it did not yet fully have, the vocabulary of the search party and the age progression photo and the tireless parent on the television couch pleading for any scrap of information. Patty Dool, mailing out 200,000 flyers, getting herself deputized, refusing to be quiet, was writing a script that countless grieving families would follow in the decades that came after, often without knowing that a mother in New Mexico had helped write it. There is a terrible dignity in that. Out of her own bottomless loss, Patty built a model of how to fight, and other parents, in their own worst hours, would lean on it. Have you ever wondered what it means to keep a name alive for 37 years? It is not a passive thing. Names fade by default. The natural gravity of time pulls every tragedy down toward forgetting, and it takes constant, deliberate effort to resist that pull. Every vigil, every anniversary article, every podcast episode, every documentary, every time the sheriff's office picks up the phone to talk to yet another stranger from across the country who wants to help, is a small act of defiance against forgetting. And the remarkable thing about Tara Calico is how many people, for how long, have chosen to perform that act. Her mother, until the day she died, her stepfather, her sister and her brother, her childhood friend who made it a mission, a lead investigator who measures success not in arrests, but in bringing her home, an entire town that still says her name in its shops and kitchens. That is not nothing. In a way, it is the opposite of what happened to her on that road. On that road, she was erased in 15 minutes. In the years since, an entire community has spent 37 years refusing to let the erasure be complete. She is still officially missing. She is also, by the ruling of a court, officially a homicide victim. She is both at once, the way she has been so many contradictory things at once throughout this case, present and absent, found and lost, known and unprovable. But underneath every theory and every photograph and every sealed file, she remains exactly what she was on the morning of September 20th, 1988, a 19-year-old girl who loved to ride, who planned her days carefully, who had a favorite book and a tennis date and a mother who told her to be safe. And it is to that girl, not to the mystery, that we owe the last word. Here is where the case stands tonight, stated plainly. Tara Lee Calico has been missing since the morning of September 20th, 1988. In 1998, a court declared her legally dead and ruled her death a homicide. In June of 2023, after decades of work, investigators announced they believed they had enough evidence to send the case to prosecutors for review of potential charges, with the persons of interest named only in sealed court records. As of the most recent reporting, no one has been charged. The case sits under review, and the search for Tara's remains continues, most recently at the bottom of an abandoned mine shaft north of Belen. Her bicycle has never been found. Her body has never been found, and no one has ever been held to account for what happened to her. But behind the sealed files and the famous photograph and the 37 years of headlines was a real young woman, a daughter, a sister, a college student with a part-time job at a bank and a favorite book she had probably read more than once. Someone who scheduled her days with care because she had things she wanted to do with them. Someone who loved the simple, physical joy of riding fast down an open road with music in her ears and the whole morning ahead of her. Someone who, on the last ordinary day of her life, made a tennis date she fully intended to keep and told her mother to come find her if she was late, because she was the kind of person who thought ahead and looked out for herself and assumed, as we all do, that she had all the time in the world. She deserved to keep that date. She deserved to grow old. She deserved so much better than a 15-minute window on a sunlit road and 37 years of silence. So tonight, as you sit with Tara's story, I hope you will remember her not for the photograph, not for the mystery, not for the things that were done to her by people who have never answered for it, but for who she actually was. For the pink bicycle and the careful schedule and the favorite novel. For the freckles and the cowlick and the easy confidence of a 19-year-old who felt invincible on her own familiar ground. Cases like Tara's ask something quiet of us. They ask us to keep paying attention, long after the cameras have moved on. They ask us to understand that the people in these stories were never characters in a mystery, but neighbors and daughters and friends living perfectly ordinary lives right up until the moment something ordinary turned. And they ask us to hold on to the small, stubborn hope that somewhere, someone who has been carrying the truth for a lifetime might finally be ready to set it down while there is still someone left to hear it. Tara was 2 miles from home. She has not made it back yet, but the people who love her and the strangers who have come to care are still out there on that road, still looking, still saying her name into the long New Mexico dark. And as long as they are, her story is not over. It is only unfinished. And somewhere, someone still knows how it ends.